We all know Oleg ZHOKH. He's a freak athlete from Ukraine. Freak in the more factual use of the word rather than any slang or informal sense. Today we're going to have a look at the conditions which help to make him this literal freak of nature. So what makes him different to the rest of us? He was born in Ukraine in the small village of Ozhenin with about 5,000 residents in 1992, so he's now 28 years old. He is apparently 6 feet or 182 centimeters tall, although this may just be typical sports exaggeration, and he competes in the under 70 kilograms class, walking around at just under 80 kilograms, which is quite light if he is 182 centimeters tall. And the question we all want to know, how far is this little village from Chernobyl? Well, it's about 350 kilometers and takes about 5 hours to drive from one place to the other. So a decent distance, but not very far at all for radiation to be carried by the wind, especially considering radiation readings from Chernobyl were found as far as Germany and Finland, and with the incident taking place in 1986, 6 years before his birth, the possibility of him being mutated at birth from this residual radioactivity saturating his parents' living place is not zero. So on the off chance that this was a mutation from Chernobyl, Oleg would have been quite lucky. Mutations are broadly classified as either negative, neutral or positive. The majority of DNA mutations are neutral and silent, not really expressing themselves in any exceptional way or being able to survive the process of protein synthesis. The majority of mutations we do hear about in relation to Chernobyl were negative, causing loss of function compared to an average standard human, which would have been mostly down to people sent into or around the site itself, or before birth, which would have been mostly down to parents or developing fetuses' exposure to radiation, either through direct exposure or existing around saturated material for long enough, like food and plants. But positive mutations, which in many respects Oleg's would have been, mutate the DNA of the subject in ways which produce greater outcomes than the average person would be able to produce. So irrespective of exactly how Oleg obtained this mutation, he has at some point come into possession of a mutated DNA pattern, one which seems enduring, resilient, and entirely compatible with the rest of him. It doesn't seem to cause any harm to him for his activities and provides him with greater functions in them. Looking at this medical record from an early hospital admission, we can see it was present from birth. So from the 20th of January to the 4th of February, 16 days in 1993, he stayed in the respiratory infections department of a hospital. He was at this time around 3 months old. The doctors then diagnosed him with myelodysplasia, a blood condition where immature or stem cells do not develop fully into red blood cells or white blood cells or platelets, instead sticking around in these immature forms and stealing available space from any usable cells that do form. So this would give issues with things like oxygen distribution to the body or blood not clotting on injury, or an inability to fight infections or bacteria. He was brought in because his mother had noticed his left hand seemed deformed and with limited movement. So this could have been related to the myelodysplasia. If the body was weak, particularly in the left hand with a limited blood supply, development of strength and movement patterns through the muscle could have been very restricted and non-developing, combined with the deformed and, as we see it now, abnormally large muscles on the left arm. The demand would be higher but the supply not available. No issues were detected with the internal organs, and the neural pathway to and from the brain has no issues, but the left hand is swollen with fluid beneath the skin and the hand itself is deformed as we know. In his left arm and shoulder he displays hypotonia, which is a decreased muscle tone, which in babies is often due to fetal complications resulting in a reduced supply of blood and oxygen to the muscle tissue, which we have already noted as an issue with Oleg's blood cells not maturing into oxygen-bringing red blood cells. With the hypotonia being limited to the left arm and shoulder, we can assume that the mutation in that side is the issue, and the reduced supply is not spread across the entire body. He also has reduced motor activity and tendon reflexes in the same arm, which again points to a reduced supply to help those structures develop in the formative stages. So some neurosternal blood flow scans around the brain show most of the tissue to be fine except for the third ventricle, which seems slightly swollen with fluid. They decided not to extract tissue from the left arm to examine, so it probably didn't seem too severe. and they recommended that he receives exercise therapy and massage to promote blood flow, release the fluids, and encourage general well-being of the tissue. And then just some general vitamins and nutritional supplementation recommended to support his growth alongside the physiotherapy, exercise, and massages. So after this, his parents took him home and I assume implemented these prescriptions, and somewhere along the line his arm and hand achieved a fully operational state. His father says that originally this arm was weaker, but through exercise and training it gained strength and eventually surpassed the right, the more normal side in strength, which you can imagine given the greater muscle available. So let's look at the physical layout of this limb and what about it gives him such an advantage over his other. It's difficult to see without a full in-depth scan and/or dissection of Oleg where exactly the limb differences begin, but it does seem from what I can tell to cover the entire arm and shoulder, although this might be more due to him being able to train that side with greater loads and the entire limb benefiting from this. But for certain we can see that his brachioradialis is the main difference. It seems to originate from a similar place to his right arm, so not abnormally high up the humerus, but the length it extends down the forearm and the point it inserts back into the bone is much greater. This gives him an immediate advantage in elbow flexion, as Grappler brought up in a comment on the video on hand growth. I've always been curious as to whether it would be possible to detach and reattach ligaments in a more mechanically advantageous position. Even a small change in angle makes a big difference in mechanical advantage. The bicep tendon, if it inserted further down the forearm, wouldn't curling strength be massively impacted? Well, technically if this were done with the bicep more than curling strength but forearm supination, as the main function of the bicep would be enhanced, but also curling would too. But in this case it's the brachioradialis which works directly for curling strength or elbow flexion. And with the muscle being structurally longer, giving a much greater reach to pull against the forearm from above the elbow, and the potential for it to grow in strength and size, well, the brachioradialis of OLEG ZHOKH's left arm is much better for this sport than normal. So a combination of mechanical strength and greater trainability potential leads to, as we can see, much stronger elbow flexion, which you can see on the table. He has a very strong and tight angle at the elbow, and it takes a lot of work to open him up out of it. On to the next part, the muscles on the inside of the forearm, the wrist flexors and pronators. For the pronator teres, we can't explicitly see the length it extends down the forearm, but we can see its head, which originates just the same as the brachioradialis, from a pretty normal position on the medial side of the elbow. But we can see that it gets very big very quickly, which to me at least suggests that even though the other end is buried beneath the brachioradialis, it could actually extend quite far down the forearm too, since it bulges so much at the earlier positions. So if this is true, his upper forearm is very likely also very strong and holds great potential to grow stronger. So remember that strong pronation while we quickly go to wrist strength. Here too you can see that the muscles seem to insert further down the wrist, giving more muscle tissue running further down the arm, and a greater mechanical leverage across the wrist joint in raw wrist flexion strength. The wrist too, either through muscle and tendons extending further into it, greater general mass, or greater hypertrophy through training with it, the wrist itself looks thicker than the right. So we have very strong elbow flexion from the enhanced brachioradialis, very strong pronation from the possibly enhanced pronator teres, and very strong wrist flexion from the inside arm wrist flexors also extending further down it. I think you'll agree this sounds pretty good for arm wrestling, having the ability to hold the elbow tight and close, and the wrist tightly in pronation and also flexed or cupped very closely in towards the athlete. And all of this is from pure mechanical advantage alone, not taking into account the much greater potential these leverages allow for training to be done to further strengthen the limb. And then let's get on to the hand itself, where all this mechanical witchcraft culminates and exposes itself. Well, that too is ridiculous. The spread of his metacarpal bones, the bones in the palm of his hand, is much wider than a typical hand. His thumb at the base bone seems to angle and stick outwards much more than a standard straighter one would. It's almost angled like the top of a femur. The actual finger bones themselves are almost average, except for being longer, other than the tip of the index finger, which seems to halt abruptly. But you can see that he has a much wider hand, and the fingers are spread more widely across it, giving much greater finger pressure and control real estate to work with. And then onto the hand meat, which is some kind of amorphous blob of tissue which we'll assume is muscle. The muscles I went over before, the ones that I think were the most beneficial to try and add size to your hand with, the base of the thumb and the base of the little finger. Well, Oleg seems to have double or triple helpings of both of these. His hand is just a massive meat that I think anybody will have trouble holding onto without straps. So, tremendous elbow flexion strength, enormously strong wrist, especially with cupping and pronation, and a huge hand. What does this give us? Well, it gives us OLEG ZHOKH, an arm wrestling phenom who even the top level athletes have a very hard time opening up. You can see, even when he does get pinned, his wrist very rarely opens or supinates, so trying to top roll OLEG ZHOKH might be a bad time. And that's about it. OLEG ZHOKH is a pretty good arm wrestler. Through his genetic mutations give him mechanical advantages and a greater ability to train and improve. I hope you enjoyed this video. There are not many genetic anomalies like this out there, obviously, but there are a few more I can think of. So let me know if you have anybody you want covering and I'll get on that, but otherwise I'll see you later.